I want to give you a little bit of background before I read the first passage that I selected tonight. I grew up on the East Coast, surrounded by water. My dad was an avid outdoorsman, and so much of my childhood was spent hunting, fishing, and camping near water. Usually the year began for us in the early spring when we would get on the Delaware River and fish for shad. When the shad run ran off, we would then switch to fly fishing for trout on streams nearby. Then we would move to lakes and ponds to fish for bass. And then in the fall, we would start hunting for pheasant and grouse along the banks of a river. In the winter, we would drive south and find cranberry bogs to hunt quail. So I was always near water. In the summer, I would spend a couple of weeks on a lake in the Adirondack Mountains, usually a week on a lake in Pennsylvania. And when I was home, I would ride my bike down to the local pond and spend the day swimming with my buddies. So growing up, water was not just background, it was foreground. And I can't say that I took it for granted, but for me, it was always sort of a given. Water was just part of the landscape. I did not visit a desert until 1973. I quit a teaching job back east, and my wife and I drove out west, as we said back then, and we visited Capitol Reef National Park. My wife's brother had just been assigned as a ranger there, and so that was my first experience with the desert. As I write in Canaries on the Rim, at first it was kind of a shock. I'd never encountered a landscape that was as vast and arid as the one that we have here in Utah. But like a lot of tourists, I fell in love with the canyon country and I wanted to return. I did that about a year later. We were actually coming from a lake in Vermont, where we had been running a lodge and some cottages. And we stopped again at Capitol Reef and fell into jobs caretaking the old Sleeping Rainbow Guest Ranch, which had closed a couple of years earlier. We were there for 4 years. And the last 2 years, we actually leased and operated the guest ranch as our own business. Our oldest child, my son Brian, was born while we were living at the ranch. And those were really formative years for us. I think my experiences there shaped the person I've become. And I want to read you a passage from Canaries on the Rim, Living Downwind in the West, which I think expresses those changes that we went through. During our years in the wilderness, we learned compelling, fundamental, and ancient lessons that we had missed during our modern education while immersed in the American way. For the first time in our lives, the connection between our bodies and the water and soil that nourished us appeared short and simple. Back in the city, water was an abstraction. It poured magically from a tap on an underground network of pipes that drained a faraway reservoir I had never seen and probably couldn't locate offhand. To keep it flowing, I merely paid a bill. At the ranch, our drinking water and irrigation water gathered on the Aquarius Plateau and tumbled down the face of Boulder Mountain, where it fed the riparian oasis under our window. I was responsible for clearing the irrigation headgate and ditches of flood debris, cleaning the filters on the drinking water cistern under the lodge, and maintaining the pump that pulled the water up from a spring beside the creek. When the pump failed, we carried our water each day. One winter, we had to melt snow for cooking and drinking when a pipe between the spring and the lodge froze. In Eastern America, where water is everywhere, water's life-sustaining role is hidden in the lush background. In the baked desert lands of the West, water's gift becomes foreground that is underlined boldly. As any desert dweller will readily attest, water is life. Humans too are fluid creatures. I do not mean that we are graceful and agile, though some are, but that we bleed, blister, urinate, salivate, sweat, and cry. Our bodies are a community of fluids. While living on the ranch, the ways that water reached our habitat from the sky and how we incorporated it became obvious. Likewise, years of growing the corn, tomatoes, and melons that attracted and pleased our hungry guests taught us that the nutrients our bodily fluids carry arise from soil that was once leaf, limb, stone, root, bone, carcass, carapace, and flower. It was churned, swallowed, and excreted by worms, ants, mites, millipedes, beetles, and bacteria, so it could feed the plants we tended in our garden that in turn used the generous energy of the sun to make food available to us and our wilderness pilgrims. Under the sleeping rainbow, our continual bodily communion with the whole wide world was a biological fact of life. And the walls that we had built between the planetary and the personal during a previous education melted away. I went to one of those elite universities in New England where the sons and daughters of rich and powerful people were taught that to think of ourselves as these little masters of the universe who were ruling by virtue of our superior intellect and education. If there was a bumper sticker that would describe that experience, it could have been that famous quote by the philosopher René Descartes, who said, "I think, therefore I am." I think the bumper sticker for my re-education at the Sleeping Rainbow could have been, "I stink, therefore I am." It was very grounding. And those lessons that I learned there served me well later on. Eventually, we left the guest ranch and moved up north, as people in southern Utah are still doing, because that's where the opportunities are. We entered a period of nesting. We had 2 more children. My oldest child was born while we were at the ranch. We had 2 more kids. I became a bookmobile librarian, drove a bookmobile around the West Desert, and my wife became a special education teacher. We lived in Grantsville, which is on the rim of the Great Basin Desert. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that. 40 years ago, that was a pretty rural town. It was small. We thought that that was probably a great environment for raising kids, and it was. But as we lived there, we slowly became aware that there was a lot of illness. It wasn't just cancer. There were a lot of autoimmune illnesses. We later discovered that there was a cluster of MS in town, and that was very concerning. We attributed the illness that we saw around us to occupational exposures. At that time in Tooele County, the major employers were underground mining, a copper smelter where you might be exposed to arsenic, a magnesium refinery where you were definitely exposed to chlorine gas. If you worked at the Army Depot, another major employer, they had twin missions. One was to store and handle chemical weapons, and the other was to clean and rebuild diesel engines with some very powerful solvents. So there were many reasons why people might end up getting sick because they went to work. And we thought that that was sad, but somehow logical. That changed, I think, when my wife started teaching. She was coming home and saying, this really can't be normal. There are just too many kids with disabilities, too many kids who are suffering in town. I realized one day that I could stand on my front porch steps, my front steps, and actually point to a home where a child had just died of leukemia, to a home where a child had just been born missing a kidney, to a home where a child was suffering spina bifida, and to 3 homes where children were in wheelchairs, Travis, Holly, Jason. At that time, all of my parental alarms went off, and I had to ask myself the question, did I inadvertently move my children into harm's way when I moved to Grantsville? The next many years were spent on a sort of a quest to find out what had happened, what could be done about it, and probably more importantly, what could be done to make sure that nobody else suffered in the future. I was well positioned to lead that quest because I had already learned lessons about how we embody our environment while living at the Sleeping Rainbow Ranch. The people I work with were people I referred to as northern downwinders. Like the downwinders who were from Kanab and southern Utah, those people had also been exposed to radioactive fallout from atomic testing in the 50s and the 60s. In addition, they were downwind from the Dugway Proving Grounds, where more than 630 open air tests with chemical weapons were conducted, and more than 100 tests with biological and radiological weapons. The tests were pretty sloppy, pretty reckless. They finally ended in '68 when some nerve gas got away from them and 6,000 sheep in the next valley over dropped dead. During that time, the people I worked with were learning lessons the hard way and often too late that I had learned under much different circumstances at the Sleeping Rainbow Ranch. My mantra at that time tried to inform people how public health is very much affected by environmental quality. And I would say that although we live in a culture that enables us and encourages us to think and feel and act as if we are living above and beyond nature, disconnected from nature. You know, nature is something we visit on weekends. In reality, we embody our environments. You are what you eat and what you drink and what you breathe. And that's a biological fact of life. If you doubt it, there's a very simple experiment that you can do at home. You can just stop eating for 3 weeks. You can stop taking in fluids for 3 days, or you can stop breathing for 3 minutes. And your body will make the case for you that life is the process of translating a physical environment into experience. So given that the decisions we make, the collective decisions we make about what we allow into our air and our water, our soil and our food get translated into flesh and blood, bone, nerve, daily experience, it's vital that we make those decisions in ways that are open, transparent, inclusive, informed, and accountable. I consider that to be democracy 101. And so this is something that Taylor can talk about in the discussion part of this program. I want to get back to water. I've spent 40 years hiking in canyon country, and I've realized that not only is water the source of life, but water carves the land, shapes the land, and also shapes the biosphere in the land. And I want to read a passage from my second book, Hope's Horizon, 3 Visions for Healing the American Land. And it talks about floods. Let me get a drink of water and then I'll set that up for you. Before the passage that I'm going to read to you, I explained that my brother-in-law, Bill, and I had hiked into a very remote canyon in the San Rafael Swell. It was hot, and we counted on going to a spring near where our destination was and refilling our water. When we got there, we found that the spring had dried up, and that was disturbing. We climbed up a canyon to find another water source, and luckily we did. But while we were up there, just a huge thunderstorm broke overhead. The canyon that we had come up in flooded, and we found ourselves climbing up to a ledge and were trapped overnight in an alcove, listening to the floods pass underneath us and hoping that the water didn't rise to the point where it swept us away. So this is a passage that I think explains the role of water in canyon geology. There is something about a cave that invites a story. As we waited for the parade of storms to pass and subside, we told each other about our first floods. I will never forget mine. It happened on a summer day in Capitol Reef along the lush banks of Pleasant Creek, just below the Sleeping Rainbow Ranch where we were living. We watched a storm break over the face of Boulder Mountain several miles away and suspected a flood was coming, although the sun-drenched stillness of the afternoon offered no hint or clue. We watched and waited for so long that we decided nothing was coming after all. Just as we turned back towards the ranch house, we heard an utterly unique and ominous shush of gravel and the knocking percussion of stones rolling and clapping against one another underwater. The weird sound grew louder, followed by the oddest sight I'd ever seen. The advancing tongue of the flood was like a rolling wall of grass, sticks, tumbleweeds, and leaves. It looked dry and seemed to be migrating slowly. Its speed, however, was deceptive. Just as we turned back towards the ranch house, we heard once the debris pile it was pushing with its nose had passed, the flood revealed a full throttle power that was humbling. Anything swept up in that rushing current would be as helpless as a rag in a hurricane. The roar of boulders bouncing along beneath the swollen water was so loud that we had to shout at each other to be heard. When the banks of the creek started to cave in and wash away, we walked a safe distance from the boiling stew of earth and rain. A couple of hours later, the waters ebbed, and by the next morning, Pleasant Creek was reduced to fresh puddles threaded by a thin, meandering banner of chalky water. Weeks later, a carpet of fresh grass embroidered by wildflowers pushed up through the drying mud. Bees and butterflies danced to a chorus of birdsong along the flood's green wake. Frogs plopped into fresh water that was covered with tasty bugs skating on gossamer legs. Potholes teemed and swarmed. Buds poked up along the edges of the stranded and stagnant pools. The flood's hammer blow was followed by a delicate caress, and in a million nooks and crannies, life was nurtured and renewed. Life evolves according to the circumstances. One size does not fit all. Although the grammar and syntax of life may be common, ecosystems speak the vernacular of whatever landscape generates them. Just as we have learned that forest ecosystems can accommodate, incorporate, and express fire, we know that in canyon country, floods are an expression of canyon geology. Canyon plants, animals, and insects have evolved around that unavoidable fact of life. Wildfires and floods are natural disturbances that play key functions in their ecosystems despite their unpredictable timing. Just as a forest fire can break seeds in its wake, thus renewing growth, flash floods in canyon country landscapes pulse moisture and nutrients into dry reaches where life has evolved to bloom, breed, and recede quickly. Canyon country is scattered with hidden pockets of water called potholes, which can hold anywhere from a couple of quarts to thousands of gallons of precious water. Because floods replenish the water and nutrients in potholes, they bloom with sudden activity after a rain. Floods fire the starting gun in a procreative race that evolution has fine-tuned to fit the circumstances. 2 days after a big flood, the typical desert floor becomes the scene of a bug and toad orgy. Desert mammals rely on potholes for drinking water. Floodwaters also reload precious seeps and springs, create quicksand reservoirs, and are pumped up into the fleshy architecture of succulent plants. Floods carve the land into niches, and a persistent creative life force loads those niches with microbial critters, insects, birds, plants, fish, and animals that fit together to become communities, tuned into and dependent on one another. And so that's my testimony on water. And I think at this point, maybe I've been talking for about 17 minutes, I think. So maybe Taylor, you can take it away at this point and ask some questions.
Sure. So let's start with maybe, I'm really interested in this question of, and I think this is a difficult question, how do you transform culture? Transform these sort of anthropocentric worldviews. And oftentimes I find it really helpful to think about the personal histories of people who practice ecocentrism, who are focused on multi-species relationships and the multi-species communities that support their life. And so I think you've already touched on this a little bit, but one question that I wanted to ask sort of more specifically is, when did you start practicing, or when do you really feel like you started practicing and internalizing ecocentrism? You mentioned your engagements in New England, that sort of, with like fishing and things like that, but my question is sort of more like, did you feel, as you said before, like a master of the universe before moving west, and then the arid desert, the sort of sparseness of life in the desert was sort of really transformative to you, and you really began to internalize ecocentrism? Or did you feel like that actually that worldview really did predate moving west?
Well, the experiences that I had at the Sleeping Rainbow were definitely formative. As I said, I grew up outdoors, but basically playing, in swimming, fishing, and so forth. I didn't really think too seriously of it. And of course, when you're a kid, you don't think, I never thought very philosophically. At the ranch, we had more time to contemplate the changes that were around us and how they affected us. Then, of course, when I moved north, suddenly that health connection became not just very interesting or revealing, but almost dire, because I had fear that maybe we had been exposed to something that would make us sick. I'm often labeled an environmentalist. I accept that I describe myself that way. It's kind of a shorthand that people understand. Somebody once said, what do you write about? And I said, well, I write about arrogance and folly, resilience and humility. And that elicited a response. People just looked at me like I had one eye in the center of my head. So I said, well, I write about the environment, and everyone understood that. The term, though, environmentalist sort of implies that I have a philosophy or an ideology, and I do, but I acquired that through experience. In the very beginning, when I started getting involved politically, I think that you could boil my politics down to something that was very parental, which was keep your damn poison away from my children's bloodstream. It was that simple. But as I became involved and more active, I began to see that there are cultural connections. I've dealt with a lot of different issues, conservation issues. When I was on the board of SUA, when I was in Tooele County, it was more about air and toxic waste and so forth. What you'll find when you get involved in those issues is that They all have their own policies, their own laws, their own stakeholders, their own rules, their own histories. And in order to be effective, you have to learn all of the specifics of that. But I think that what they all have in common, regardless of how we fragment them and treat them, is that underlying it, there seems to be a mentality that either sees the world as a set of interwoven living communities, or you simply see the world as a collection of commodities that are disconnected. I've stood in a forest and looked at a beautiful, magnificent tree, and a person on one side of me said, "Oh my gosh, isn't that just inspiring?" And the person on the other side of me was calculating how many board feet were in that tree. So it's sort of like that. So you find that even if you're dealing with the politics of an environmental issue, you're also, I think, trying to teach ecological literacy and trying to make that connection between public health and the environment.
Mm. And how do you define resilience? What does resilience mean to you?
What does the what?
What does resilience mean to you?
Resilience. I think that resilience is the ability of an ecosystem. I mean, there's personal resilience, and if you look up resilience, if you Google it, that's what you're going to find is 101 articles on self-help. And we probably could use a lot of those right now in the middle of a pandemic. Ecological resilience means that despite the pressure, the stresses, or the damage that's done to an ecosystem, it can repair itself and come back. That usually happens because there's biodiversity available and numerous options for that ecosystem to recover. There's a new program that just started on PBS called The Age of Nature, and it is trying to take a little bit of a hopeful bent and say, you know, there are ecosystems that have been repaired and restored. And usually that's done by just giving nature enough time to heal itself. And that to me is a kind of resilience that is built in. It's a life force that's available if we learn how to tap it. And I mean tap it, not control it, but more or less dance with it.
Mm. Oh, I like that, dance with it. That's a good way of putting it. I was also wondering about, you know, sort of speaking of the land as a community versus the land as a commodity, which I think is a really significant difference that you bring out in your work, specifically in Hope's Horizon. And I've been wondering about whether environmentalists have a kind of ethical imperative to make arguments about environmental protections for watersheds or wildlife linkages, sacrifice zones, based on an the inherent value of the land, and not about the dollar values that we typically assign to it. And so I guess my question is, does making fiscal arguments about ecosystem services, about the ecosystem services of a healthy waterway, for instance, fundamentally undermine the cultural shift, land as community, we are advocating for? Or do we sometimes need to speak the language of capitalism, citing, you know, higher yields of a biologically diverse community or dollars saved, in order to frame the land as a commodity to find common ground with the people in power?
Well, there is a tendency in the last several years to try to assign value to ecosystem services. And you get these phenomenal, you know, geez, the water system is worth $1 trillion here and this is worth $1 trillion there. I understand that it does sort of offend if you think that some of these things like drinking water is precious and beyond value. To assign value to it. We're in a transition right now, and you're right. We do have a capitalist mentality. We do think about things in terms of profit and usefulness, and we have really not understood in a wide, well-distributed way what a lot of those personal values are to the environment. Most people don't think about where their drinking water comes from. Most people understand the weather, but they don't understand the climate. Most people aren't ecologically literate. So it's very hard to talk to those people about the value of a forest, the value of a lake or a river, in terms that they're just not familiar with. So it's sort of understandable, but I know what you mean. It's always sort of offends me when someone puts a dollar value on it. I think what they're trying to do is say that these things are incredibly valuable, and that is a good reason for serving, protecting, and making sure that they have integrity.
Mm. And what sort of strategies in your own writing and your own communications as an environmental advocate do you think have worked to shift the conversation culturally to maybe find common ground with someone who sees a tree in terms of board feet rather than sort of a living being with its own inherent value? I think that there are certain strategies that work in communicating that to people and reaching people in ways that are effective.
Well, my work is sort of divided into, you might say, two separate areas. One would be conservation. Mm-hmm. The other one would be more about defending oneself against pollution. The people that I work with on issues involving pollution, radioactive waste, and so forth, very often they became involved because they became sick or someone that they loved became sick. And then they made the connection between the exposure and the consequences of exposure. So work in conservation is to sort of up that one level. It's pretty easy to see that your health might be very much affected by the water you drink. It's probably harder in our culture to understand that water comes from a watershed, and that there are many factors that affect the health and integrity of that watershed, and that there are different ways of protecting the watershed than there are of just making sure that you have clean drinking water. Again, our culture tends to not take a very holistic view of these things. We do fragment them, we do divide them up. And so trying to draw those connections from one issue to another is often challenging.
In reading Canaries on the Rim, I felt like I was reading a blueprint in a way for how to organize a community around toxicity. How to hold powerful people accountable, how to navigate politics and personalities, how to connect geographically distant movements with common values and goals together. And I was just sort of wondering if you intended to write a book that would give activists organizing around environmental injustices a model for action, or if that was sort of an accident of telling your story.
I think the Canaries on the Rim was actually written after I had written an awful lot of other stuff, trying to tell people how to get organized, how to be effective, how to communicate, and so forth. My formative writing experiences were pretty boring and very practical. I wrote newsletters, and that'll date me, back in the days before we had blogs and websites and Twitter and so forth. We had print, we had newsletters. I wrote hundreds of newsletters. I wrote press packets. I wrote op-eds, letters to the editor, statements to be read at panels and debates and public hearings. And all of that writing was done on the fly. Everything was needed yesterday. And, building an environmental campaign is like the old cliche of building the airplane as it taxis down the runway. My job was to try to explain what we were doing so that the crew wasn't running up and down the aisles with their hair on fire. There's probably no tried and true formula for building a campaign. I certainly learned it all the hard way. We were incredibly naive when we started. the first money that I got for the first organization I started came from Robert Redford. Unsolicited, he gave us money, he said, I read your newsletter, I want to pay for the postage. And he then suggested, you know, if you became a formal nonprofit, other people could donate to you. That was like a revelation to us. We said, oh, well, there's an idea, we could do that. Over and over, we learned those lessons sort of firsthand in the hard way. So my advice to people is to find others who share your interests, your concerns, and you know, if you work hard enough at it, the answers will be there. You'll figure out what you need to do next.
Yeah, and I was wondering, you know, as I was reading Canaries on the Rim, it sort of, and as you're describing the sort of endurance that this kind of work really does take, you know, it occurred to me that democracy is really hard work. And that holding leadership accountable or stopping destructive and exploitative projects takes a considerable amount of energy. It's the kind of work that requires surplus time, time that people with young families, as you describe in Canaries on the Rim, people with, you know, multiple working class jobs or unstable living conditions or unstable living circumstances are unlikely to have. So, and these are also the same groups that are most directly affected by toxicity often. And so I'm wondering, how do organizations like Heal Utah make political engagement more accessible for those groups?
Well, one of the ways it makes political involvement more accessible is simply by existing. It's very hard to do these things by yourself. You can sit at home and you can write letters and make phone calls. You can complain to your neighbors, air your grievances and so forth. But you're right, if you try to do it all yourself, you burn out very quickly. It is much more time consuming than people usually, you know, when I got involved, I had just finished a master's degree. And I said, well, I think I have a little time on my hands now that I didn't have before. And I could do this for a year or two and get it done. And, you know, 15 years later, when I moved away and came down to Torrey, I was still hard at it. So you have to be prepared to work over the long run. And you have to celebrate your victories and understand that you don't get there all at once, you get there incrementally. And it really helps if you have other people who can hold your hand and who can take over for you when you're tired or when you burn out or when something, you know, something happens at home and you can't give it the time and energy that you want. That's why these things are done by groups of people. If you've got a cause, find a group that agrees with you, introduce yourself, find a skill that you're good at. Most of these groups are a collection of different people with different skills. And if you can all find your own niche and work together, you'd be much more effective.
In a lot of your work, you talk about the importance of empowering everyday citizens, you know, to join these organizations, to speak up, to speak truth to power, even while political leaders and maybe a, you know, kind of technocratic elite might dismiss their stories or invalidate their ways of knowing as inconclusive or unscientific. From my own experience, I think this kind of confidence in new spaces can be very difficult to build as a layperson and as someone who doesn't walk the halls of government every day. And so I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind sharing an example or two of moments in your life when you felt particularly empowered to speak up about an injustice and what emboldened you in those moments.
Well, I'm foolish, and I don't have much regard for how people are thinking about me. My original organizing happened, and I'll just be frank about it, in Grantsville was a very LDS community. And a lot of people were reluctant to speak up because they didn't want to rock the boat. In a small town, you don't want to criticize your neighbor's employer. I was lucky. I was a bookmobile librarian. I wasn't employed at MagCorp or at the Army Depot or any of those other places. I was not a member of the church, so I was not particularly concerned about whether I was going to upset anybody in my local church hierarchy. In a way, my outsider status gave me the freedom to say things that other people wanted to say, but either couldn't bring themselves to say or simply didn't have the background to say. Um, and you're right. I think that the most effective environmental organizations focus not simply on attaining a goal and you know, accomplishing A, B, or C. They do that, but also to empower those around them and to encourage them to push the envelope and to learn skills. Because the nature of the struggle that we're in today is so large and so long lasting that all you can really do is take your turn. You know, I had a message from a friend of mine who has been involved with downwinders for many, many years, when she heard that there's a proposal to restart nuclear testing. She was sort of despairing and said, sometimes it feels like all the work we did was really, we're just starting all over again. And I wrote back and said, yes, and every generation really starts again, and we take our turn and we push the wheel a little farther up the hill, and that's really all we can do. And it's enough. If enough of us do that, change happens. Also, change happens so slowly that very often we don't see it. I'll give you an example. Conservation used to mean that you find a natural environment and you put up a parking lot and some places for people to camp, and maybe you develop some water, and then you sell them fishing and hunting licenses. Maybe even you put in a dam and stop a river and stock it with non-native fish. That was conservation, hooks and bullets, for a long time. A few years ago, when I was working at the city library, a man who had studied wildlife biology in the 1950s after the war died and left us his book collection. And I went down to the collection and I had a little Post-it card with various terms written on it, terms that anybody who was studying the environment today would know, things like keystone species, habitat, and I had about 5 or 6 of these common terms. I went through the indexes of the books that he used to learn wildlife biology and wildlife management back in the 50s. I couldn't find any of those terms. So even though it hasn't seemed like it, there has been a kind of a revolution in our awareness of how ecosystems are put together, what's connected, what our role is supposed to be, and so forth. It's hard sometimes to see that we're getting there, but we are getting there.
Yeah, so I mean, you mentioned the pace of change is slow. You know, I kind of wonder about, you know, the reality of that with the reality of climate change, right? I mean, there's a window of time in which action, you know, to act even in the next, you know, to make some sort of concerted changes in the next decade could actually make a great deal of difference down the line. I mean, these things do have, you know, we're looking at really needing to transform things in the next couple of decades. And so for a young person looking at a very slow, you know, this sort of slow pace of change, that can be quite frustrating when, you know, when you know that something needs to happen now, and it has been urgent for a very long time, but it sort of only grows in urgency as time passes.
Yes, I would say that the urgency feels more than it ever did. You know, in a way, we've been stealing from the future for a long time. If you have an aquifer, for example, since we're on the subject of water, supposedly.
Gosh, sorry, I forgot.
Yeah. If you're an aquifer that took thousands of years to form, and you use it up in a geological instant, which could just be 100 years, you're really stealing from the future. We've been able to do that for a long time, but now the future is here. The future is witnessing our behavior, and the future is your generation, because your generation and my children, my grandchildren, will be inheriting that messed up world that we've been ignoring for so long. And so it's not only urgency, but it's an intensity of involvement that we're seeing now that I've never seen before. When I see what the groups like the Sunrise Movement are doing and so forth, it becomes clear to me that although we don't have much time, we do have a lot of urgent energy. So that's hopeful. I think also too that there are trends today that are helpful. You know, back in my childhood, we had doctors smoking on TV and telling us what cigarettes were recommended. We didn't have all the self-help books. We didn't have all the concerns about diet. Organic was a term that I didn't know until I was an adult. Today, I think people are much more aware that the environment is not just out there, it's about your own body. I always felt that we made a big mistake by calling ourselves environmentalists. The environment is a very abstract notion. It could be the room you're sitting in tonight. It could be your neighborhood, your state, your region, your country, the planet. And my point was more that, not that we're out to protect the environment, we're out to protect our own health and the health of those we love, because we embody our environment. I would have been happier if we had referred to ourselves as embodimentalists.
I want to make sure that others feel like they can pose questions and jump in as they want. I don't know how much time we have left, but I just want to make sure it's open to everyone to participate. And you can drop questions in the comments as well. In an essay you wrote about the public library and the chronically unsheltered, you said, and I apologize for quoting your own words at you, but I want to offer context for everyone else. You said, "When the mentally ill whom we have thrown onto the streets haunt our public places, their presence tells us something important about the state of our union, our national character, our priorities, and our capacity to care for one another. That information is no less important than the information we provide through databases and books. The presence of the impoverished mentally ill among us is not an eloquent expression of civil discourse like a lecture in the library's auditorium, but it speaks volumes nonetheless." I'm curious, what did your time at the Salt Lake Public Library teach you about the way everyday citizens confront and process disturbing feedback about the condition of their own community?
Well, I learned a lot about how people share information. Some of it was sort of surprising. For example, I assumed, and coming from a background that had a fair amount of academia in my life, that if you want to research a topic or find out about something, you go to nonfiction books and you read and you study. Actually, I think most people don't get their information that way. They get them through stories. What I learned as a librarian is that we are hardwired as human beings for narrative. There's something about stories that appeal to us and that resonate. And so very often a work of fiction about a topic will be far more effective than a large tome that's full of facts. We do respond to issues on an emotional level. And so what I learned as a librarian was that you can't just throw facts at people. That may work for some people, that's what they want. But you also have to put it in the context of their own lives, their own wishes, their own dreams, their own future, and connect to them viscerally. You know, Michael Soule, who is generally regarded as the father of conservation biology, who I wrote about in the second book, told me that if you look at the organizations that protect animals and pets and are concerned with animal cruelty and all, that generally speaking, they raise a lot more money and enlist a lot more people than environmental or conservation causes. He said, it's frustrating for me because I'm not really concerned about animal cruelty. I've watched wolves devour a calf in front of the calf's mother. There's cruelty all over nature. I'm interested in saving whole species. And so it's sort of frustrating. But what I've learned is that the reason that that is so is that because that really is, for many people, their closest connection to nature. They don't think about a watershed. They don't think about air quality or climate. They think about wild creatures, and they relate to that. And it's a much more emotional and visceral reaction. And that's okay. It's okay to tap into those feelings.
Mm.
Let me just interrupt real quick, and I'm just going to say too, so we did have somebody just ask a question in the chat, and does it have to be in the chat? So if you do have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and just speak up. No shyness here. We're all friends.
Well, this is Jamie. If you're going to let me just ask questions, I'm going to go ahead. I'm curious, and thank you so much for this talk. It's been so interesting. And when I was a young person, I read your book, Canaries on the Rim, as recommended by all of my great environmentalist friends. And I'm curious about your ideas of advocacy. I hear this word a lot, and I feel like there's a change in what the word advocacy means. And I wonder if you have ideas on what's going to be the newest way to advocate. Is it suing people? Is it telling people about a place? What does that word mean?
Well, it means all sorts of things, and I think you probably indicated that in your question. I think that advocacy has changed a lot. I've been really retired and living in Torrey for several years now. Things have moved online. There's social media, there's memes, there's all sorts of different ways of reaching people and putting people together through the internet and through social media that have changed advocacy a lot. Sometimes it has sort of, I think, backfired. I'm a little tired of petition advocacy. I think that by offering people constant petitions, sign your name against this, sign your name against that, it kind of lets people off the hook. You push the button and you say, there, I'm a righteous person and I'm doing my part. Where in reality, sometimes you really have to do the hard thing, which is knock on your neighbor's door and talk to them about the issues and maybe get them to join something or change their behavior or vote or donate money or whatever. So advocacy is still the same old business. I think that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez won her election by knocking on doors and sort of opened up to a lot of people that old-fashioned grassroots way of organizing and advocating is still very effective, but there are myriad ways to advocate. Generally speaking, people advocate for something that they love. Even in conservation organizations and campaigns that I've worked on, you can make sort of the general point that it's important for our watershed to be healthy, or it's important for there to be a rich habitat for wild creatures and so forth. Usually, though, the people who are most effective and most active are trying to protect a specific place that they have fallen in love with and that they want to defend. On the other hand, when people are advocating for public health, it may very well be because they know someone who is sick. So it becomes personal. These days, the issues that we're dealing with are becoming more and more personal because things like climate change are affecting all of us. I may not be living in a hurricane zone, but I certainly have noticed that the meadows on the mountain above my house are turning to dust and thorns, and that the trees are stressed, and that there's less wildlife. So personal experiences are still very important.
Are there other questions that people would like to jump in and pose before we run out of time? Good. Okay. I really only have a couple of more questions here for you. You said in Canaries on the Rim that it took an MX missile to get you to look up and become politically active. I've wondered if COVID might do the same. I've hoped that COVID might do the same. Wake us up to the instabilities and injustices built into our systems and our relationships to one another in the planet, and push us to mobilize. But at the same time, I think I've also seen fatigue and a new normal taking shape. So I'm wondering, what's your take on this? Are we learning any paradigm shifting lessons about environmental and public health right now, or are we still in denial?
I think that we are going to go through some very big paradigm shifts, and I can't tell you that I could define them right now, but I think certainly we have a new appreciation of the normal life that we've left behind and how valuable that is, the life that we took for granted. I have a grandchild, fortunately, that lives right in town. I see her every day, but I have grandchildren I haven't seen for months. And, social life has become not only perilous, but it's become tedious and difficult. And so I think that we have a new appreciation of that. And I think that we also understand that together we have to listen to the scientists, and we have to spend less time looking for the politicians who push our buttons, and more for the people who are credible and who really have plans that make sense. And hopefully, when we come out of all of this, we'll have a new appreciation of our lives, and we'll value our social lives more, and we will be more aware of the social injustices that have been we've been hearing about with Black Lives Matter and so forth. A friend said not long ago, the pandemic has put in nature has put us in timeout. We have a lot to think about while we're in timeout.
I think that's a great note to end on. I think Emily wanted to jump in here. Where did she go?
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm here, sorry. It just took me a second. I just wanted to, yes, that's about it for our time. And I just wanted to thank you both so much, Taylor and Chip. Like, it was fantastic. I feel like we covered a lot of topics and issues here. So it went above and beyond kind of even what I was expecting. So thank you both so much, also for Willie for helping arrange this on behalf of Utah Humanities. And yeah, so we're just going to close out from there, and thank everybody for attending this evening, and I hope everybody has a wonderful night. So bye, everybody.